From our lofty position in this supposedly enlightened age, it's easy to look back on our industrial past with a mix of amusement, shame, embarrassment, and horror. In cotton mills, children started as scavengers, crawling beneath working machinery to clear away dust and dirt and to gather any loose cotton to prevent waste. Crawling among the moving parts was extremely dangerous. Children had their hair ripped out, their fingers and arms broken or severed, their heads crushed, or they were decapitated. If they got stuck, their entire bodies were crushed by the machinery. We forced young children up chimneys. We sent men underground to mine coal with nothing more than a cloth cap for protection against roof collapses and a canary to warn of gas. Hat makers were regularly exposed to mercury, which slowly but surely drove them insane, hence the expression mad as a hatter. Workers who painted glow-in-the-dark watch faces did so using radium, which ultimately gave them cancer. Painters, smelters, and battery manufacturers were frequently exposed to lead, leading to nerve damage and ultimately fatal poisoning. Stonecutters and foundry workers inhaled silica dust, causing scarring of the lungs. Wool and leather workers were exposed to anthrax, assembly line workers suffered repetitive strain injuries, and early medical workers faced high cancer risks due to uncontrolled exposure to X-rays. Demolition topmen were generally paid more because they were expected to work at height and acknowledgement of the risks involved. All those dangers and hazards ultimately led to the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974, the principles of which still govern workplace safety today. Furthermore, health and safety, along with worker training, has since become an industry in its own right. So workers are safer today, right? Well, yes and no. Most Western countries have long since abolished child labour, although depending where you buy your clothes, your coffee or your electronics, you may be still helping to keep that tradition alive somewhere in the world. Most mining is now done above ground. Modern hat making no longer involves mercury, and we've figured out how to make watch faces visible without the cancerous side effects. We generally kill fewer working men and women these days. But before we start patting ourselves on the back for a job well done, let's pause for a moment. The lead that caused cancer among painters and battery manufacturers hasn't disappeared. In fact, demolition workers regularly deal with that legacy. Silica dust remains a serious and ever-present hazard for demolition and construction workers today. There's still a risk of anthrax exposure for workers disturbing old plaster, particularly in traditional wattle and daub houses where horsehair was used to bind the plaster. And no discussion of workplace toxins is complete without mentioning the biggest killer of them all, asbestos, which continues to kill tens of thousands of people around the world each year. As a society, we recognise the dangers of children crawling beneath machinery. We don't allow that anymore. Yet we are still content to engineer construction and demolition projects that require men and machines to work in dangerously close proximity. We know that working at height remains the leading cause of deaths in demolition and construction, yet we continue to expect workers to do precisely that. Our industrial forebears did what they did out of greed, yes, but also out of ignorance. There's no evidence to suggest that they were aware of the potentially deadly effects of anthrax, radium, lead, and asbestos. We have no such excuse. Modern science, statistical analysis, and the evidence of our own eyes tells us that working at height is dangerous and potentially deadly. We choose to keep doing it. We know that if men and machines work side by side, often in confined spaces, it's only a matter of time before someone is struck, maimed, or killed. Yet we continue to plan our works that create precisely that scenario. And we know that exposure to asbestos will likely kill you in the end. While we now have systems to handle asbestos once it's been identified, we still treat demolition workers like mine canaries, sending them in blindly or with incomplete asbestos reports. For all our Health and Safety at Work Act regulations, workers' rights, training programs, competence cards, and personal protective equipment, demolition and construction safety has failed to keep pace with the evolution of the industry itself, and it has failed to heed many of the lessons from the past. In fact, we're exposing today's workers to many of the same hazards that injured, maimed, and killed their forebears 100 or more years ago. Worse still, we're doing so knowingly.